Torch, narrow. Description. The torch, narrow function extracts a contiguous subtensor from a given tensor along a specified dimension. It returns a new tensor that contains the specified portion of the input tensor. Inputs. Input 1 tensor, the input tensor from which to extract the subtensor. Input 2 int, the dimension along which to extract the subtensor. Input 3 start int, the starting index of the extracted subtensor along the specified dimension. Input 4 length int, the length of the extracted subtensor along the specified dimension. Outputs. Output 1 subtensor, the extracted subtensor. Steps. Step 1, the function identifies the specified dimension dim in the input tensor. Step 2, it then extracts a subtensor from the specified dimension starting at the given index. Start and with the specified length. Challenges and fixes. Challenge 1, index out of bounds if the specified start index is negative or exceeds the bounds of the dimension. It raises an index error. Sample use case that resulted in challenge 1 when the start index is greater than the total size of the dimension. Fixes to challenge 1 ensure that the start index is within the valid range of the dimension. Challenge 2, length out of bounds if the specified length is negative or exceeds the remaining length of the dimension from the start index. It raises an index error. Sample use case that resulted in challenge 2 when the length is greater than the remaining length of the dimension from the start index. Fixes to challenge 2 ensure that the length is within the valid range of the dimension from the start index. Challenge 3, invalid dimension if the specified dimension is invalid, e.g. outside the range of available dimensions in the input tensor. It raises an index error. Sample use case that resulted in challenge 3 when the specified dimension does not exist in the input tensor. Fixes to challenge 3 verify that the dimension index is within the bounds of the input tensor. Challenge 4, empty subtensor if the specified length is 0. An empty subtensor is returned. Sample use case that resulted in challenge 4 when the length is set to 0. Fixes to challenge 4 ensure that the length is not 0 if you require a non-empty subtensor. Torch, narrow copy. Description. The torch, narrow copy function creates a new tensor that is a narrowed version of the input tensor along a specified dimension. This means it extracts a contiguous portion of the tensor along that dimension. The resulting tensor shares the underlying storage with the original tensor, making it a view. This implies that any changes made to the new tensor will also affect the original tensor. Inputs. Input 1 input, this is the source tensor from which the narrowed version will be created. Input 2 dim, this is the dimension along which the tensor will be narrowed. Input 3 start, the starting index of the narrowed portion along the specified dimension. Input 4 length, the length of the narrowed portion along the specified dimension. Outputs. Output 1, a new tensor containing the narrowed portion of the input tensor. It is a view, meaning it shares the same underlying storage as the input tensor. Output 2, none. Steps. Step 1, the function identifies the specified dimension dim in the input tensor. Step 2, it then extracts a contiguous portion of the tensor starting at the specified index start and extending for the given length. Challenges and fixes. Challenge 1, attempting to narrow beyond the bounds of the input tensor. This could lead to an index error. Sample use case that resulted in challenge 1, torch, narrow copy tensor. Dim 0. Start 10. Length 5 where the tensor has only 8 elements along the specified dimension. Fixes to challenge 1 ensure that the start index plus length does not exceed the total size of a specified dimension in the input tensor. Challenge 2 modifying the narrowed tensor unintentionally modifies the original tensor. Sample use case that resulted in challenge 2 narrowed tensor torch, narrow copy tensor. Dim 0, start 0, length 3 narrowed tensor 010 where the input tensor is modified as well. Fixes to challenge 2 if you need to modify the narrowed tensor without impacting the original tensor. Consider creating a copy of the narrowed tensor using narrowed tensor clone. This will detach it from the original tensor. Torch tensor narrow. Description: the torch narrow function extracts a contiguous subtensor from the input tensor based on the specified dimension, start index, and length. It effectively creates a view into the original tensor, allowing you to access a specific portion without creating a copy. Inputs. Input 1 input, the input tensor from which to extract the subtensor. Input 2 dim, the dimension along which to extract the subtensor, e.g. 0 for rows, 1 for columns. Input 3 start, the starting index of the subtensor along the specified dimension. Input 4 length, the number of elements to include in the subtensor along the specified dimension. Outputs. Output 1 output, the extracted subtensor. Steps. Step 1 the function identifies the specified dimension dim in the input tensor. Step 2 it selects a contiguous slice of elements starting at the given start index and extending for length elements along the identified dimension. Step 3 it returns the extracted subtensor as a new tensor that shares the same underlying memory with the original tensor. Challenges and fixes. Challenge 1 out of bounds index if the start index or length value extends beyond the bounds of the specified dimension. An index error will be raised. Sample use case tensor torch, arrange 10, reshape 2. 5 subtensor tensor, narrow 0. 3. 4 this will raise an index error because the start index 3 is out of bounds for the first dimension size 2. Fixes ensure that the start index and length value are within the bounds of the specified dimension. Calculate these values carefully based on the size of the input tensor and the desired subtensor. Challenge 2 incorrect dimension specifying an invalid dimension, e.g. a dimension that does not exist in the tensor will result in an index error. Sample use case tensor torch, arrange 10, reshape 2. 5 subtensor tensor, narrow 2. 0. 3 this will raise an index error because the tensor only has two dimensions 0 and 1. And 2 is invalid. Fixes verify that the dim value is within the valid range of dimensions for the input tensor. Challenge 3 0 length specifying a length of 0 will result in an empty subtensor. Sample use case tensor torch, arrange 10, reshape 2. 5 subtensor tensor, narrow 1. 2. 0 this will return an empty tensor. Fixes ensure that the length value is greater than 0 if you want to extract the non-empty subtensor.